Last Thursday, a Singapore-flagged ship called the Ever Lovely was exiting the Strait of Hormuz along the Omani coastline. It was doing exactly what the newly established MOU between the US and Iran just 10 days earlier signed was saying it could do. Transiting freely, no charges, no permission required. It's following the route that has also been endorsed by the International Maritime Organization of the UN. But an Iranian drone hit it anyway. So the US retaliated just in the past 24 hours with strikes on Iranian missile storage facilities and sites and coastal radar installations. The IRGC, Iran's Revolutionary Guard, has warned of a strong response this weekend that will shatter the illusions of the aggressors. Ships that were heading for the strait made abrupt U-turns since, and traffic through Hormuz has collapsed from 70 crossings just a few days ago on Wednesday to 14. That's 10 days. That's how long this deal has effectively lasted before it's started visibly breaking apart. And this here is what I want to emphasize to you directly, because I've spent years looking at how power, money, influence, international relations all come together, how states like Iran or even Russia operate, how they negotiate, how they extract concessions, and what they do with them. Because what we're watching right now is not a ceasefire under pressure. No, it is a masterclass in coercive diplomacy. And the United States and Trump specifically are on the receiving end. Let's get into this one. There's a lot here I don't think you've fully considered.
This is The Global Gambit.
How's it going, everyone? Welcome back to the show, where we are returning to the Middle East and specifically the Strait of Hormuz, where we have seen a significant flare-up in the past 24, 48 hours and looks like it could be jeopardizing or undermining the MOU between the two sides. Indeed, this is something that is probably going to happen quite often, but this is the first one, and it doesn't look good in terms of the threats coming from Tehran, but of course also comments from the United States. Indeed, what's happening between those two is one of the most instructive examples of what we've seen. But what do you think? How does Trump play this out now? How do we see the United States navigate this and the Iranians as well? Or has he simply been outplayed by the Iranians again? Let me know in the comments. Now, to understand what's happening in the Strait of Hormuz, you need to understand what happened in the preceding 4 months before this MOU, this deal, was signed. Because the deal doesn't really make sense unless you understand the positioning America was actually negotiating from. Now, the war began on 28th of February of 26 when the US and Israel launched their airstrikes against Iran, an attempt at decapitation strategy. Now, Trump declared he wanted unconditional surrender, and he said the Iranian military had been and would ultimately be destroyed. He said the Strait of Hormuz was open when it wasn't, and by mid-March, Dubai crude oil prices had reached about $166 per barrel. That's their highest ever record. California was, and in some cases is still, paying over $5 to $8 a gallon for gasoline. Trump himself has acknowledged multiple times that the closure of Hormuz could have led to what he called an economic catastrophe that would have earned him comparisons to, say, Herbert Hoover. Now, that is the context in which this Memorandum of Understanding, or MOU, was signed on June 17th, not from a position of American victory, but from a position of American economic emergency. The strait's closure created what JP Morgan has described as the largest oil shock in history, expected to cost the world a record 1.6 billion barrels of oil supply. Trump needed Hormuz open before the midterms, and Iran has known it, and they have negotiated and acted accordingly. Indeed, anybody I've spoken to across any region, across any discipline, agrees that this isn't just a mistake by the United States. It is a strategic blunder and a strategic setback of the highest order. Look beneath that service, and of course, the picture is dramatically different. Iran has not given up its nuclear program, and Trump said that Iran would be permitted low-level nuclear enrichment, having previously called for the dismantling of the entire program. Indeed, if I remember correctly, a year ago, he said it had already been obliterated. Mixed messages there. Now, Iran has also not given up its ballistic missiles, and the deal makes no mention of them, despite them being one of the 4 critical strategic and military objectives the White House directly communicated and released in early mid-March. Iran has not given up its proxy network, Hezbollah, the Houthis, the various militias in Iraq, These are all fully operational and in some ways getting more and more confident in their desire to exercise their own interests. And so what Iran got in return? Well, an access to an estimated 20 billion in hard currency in the first 2 months, 12 billion in unfrozen funds, and 8 billion in oil export revenues. The lifting of the US naval blockade, the blockade of its blockade, the ability to sell oil to anyone, sanctions waived by the US Treasury, and a framework that could eventually, if a final comprehensive deal is reached, lift not just nuclear sanctions, but all sanctions that have ever been imposed on Iran, which, second to Russia before Putin's invasion of Ukraine, was the most sanctioned country in the world, several thousand. So those including and related to terrorism sponsorship, human rights abuses, and of course the ballistic missile program. That would spell the end of US containment policy towards Iran in place since 1979, and ultimately go against Trump's claim of wanting to liberate and protect the Iranian people. If anything, he's only given the regime, the Islamic Republic, complete free rein to do even more. The IRGC, which also controls large segments of the Iranian economy, including the oil industry, is positioned to benefit directly from the sanctions relief. The money Iran receives in these first 60 days is almost certainly being channeled towards rebuilding its military and its regional proxy network. Iran has no intention of actually drawing down. And then, of course, this 300 billion reconstruction fund that J.D. Vance suggested the Gulf Arab states would finance. Well, Saudi Arabia's foreign minister has already dismissed it. Qatar has expressed some consideration, but that's because they've been a mediator and ultimately are hedging in all of this. But nobody has committed to anything. So it's a complete and utter, as they like to say in the States, nothing burger. But here is the detail that I think matters most, and that almost nobody is actually covering properly. The deal is deliberately ambiguous about who controls the Strait of Hormuz after the first 60-day period ends. The agreement specifies that Iran is to facilitate passage through the strait with no charge for 60 days only, leaving open the question of tolls or fees completely afterwards with no time horizon. Iran's parliament speaker, Ghalibaf, has already stated that the strait will never return to its pre-war conditions and will be administered largely entirely by Iran. In a joint statement, Iran and Oman have committed to reaching an agreement on the future administration of navigation in the strait and the relative costs associated with them. Indeed, we saw what the Iranians' response was to the Omanis when the Omanis tried to implement their own form of maritime passage, a great degree of coercive diplomacy, but more on that in a second. Now, Trump has said on social media that no tolls will be charged, but Trump's statements in the text of the agreement say very different things, and probably why the administration didn't really want to release the written aspect. So what this means in practice, basically, is that Iran has extracted a 60-day window of maximum economic benefit. $20 billion, oil sales, sanctions relief, while leaving its most powerful strategic lever entirely intact, the threat of closing Hormuz again and whenever it wishes, or charging for transit, or requiring permits, or doing exactly what it did just a couple of days ago, hitting a cargo ship that was using the approved route and just largely seeing what happened, exercising its new military confidence and space. Indeed, Iran's military has declared the strait closed last week, citing Israel's strikes in Lebanon as Americans' blatant breach of the MOU, even as Iran's foreign ministry simultaneously told reporters that shipping was operating normally. So the left hand and the right hand are doing very different things, deliberately, because strategic ambiguity, as we can argue about the United States' approach to Taiwan, is leverage, and Iran understands leverage better than almost any other state operating in the current international system. But then there's another dimension to this, which is sort of getting lost in the noise of the two primary actors, and that a lot of coverage is almost entirely ignoring. And it's the perspectives of the countries that have the most to lose. The Arab Gulf states, the Saudis, the Emiratis, Bahrain, Kuwait, Qatar, were not party to US-Iran negotiations in any meaningful sense. They were present with the framework and told to support it, or risk being caught in the crossfire of resumed hostility. Even the UAE, which initially favored a military approach to addressing the Iranian threat, has since rallied behind the ceasefire agreement, not because it necessarily believes in it, but because the alternative is far worse, and they've lost a lot of expats and foreign income already. So what the Gulf states wanted from this war, the dismantling of Iran's ballistic missile program, the elimination of its proxy network, genuine constraints on its nuclear capabilities. None of that is in the deal. And if anything, as one report coming out earlier in the week emphasized, Iran could theoretically in the next 10, 15 years be the wealthiest nation in the region. Iran-backed militias have turned in Iraq into a launchpad for strikes against some of the smaller states like Bahrain or Kuwait. And the deal appears to provide protection to those same groups from further attacks. Now, the Gulf states are in a position of having to help finance Iran's reconstruction through this $300 billion fund that J.D. Vance has floated. While Iran builds the very military capabilities that we used against them months ago, instead, Saudi Arabia has said no, but that pressure will continue. And so this is the point where it all matters, because you see, understanding how states on both sides of this sort of authoritarian democratic spectrum think is crucial to interpreting these broader situations. The Gulf states know exactly what Iran is doing. They understand that a wounded Iran with 20 billion and sanctions relief and its proxy network being revitalized is more dangerous to them in 5 years than a sanctioned Iran ever was before the war. But they can't say that publicly because Trump's deal is now political fact and nobody wants to be the one who broke it. Indeed, we can see from the efforts tacitly for the Saudis to improve relations with Iran whilst distancing themselves from Israel is a degree of hedging in its own right, a pragmatism that we haven't seen throughout the past few years, let alone the months of this war. So what does this all actually reveal? Because I'm going to be direct about the frame through which I think you should read all this. This is what a deal looks like when the dominant power, the United States, has already lost the leverage, but of course can't admit it. Trump launched this war demanding unconditional surrender. He announced that this was all about regime change within the first 12 hours of the initial round of strikes. He said Iran's military would be destroyed and that the strait would be reopened and then was open for most of the war when it wasn't. None of those things were true, unsurprisingly, but Iran absorbed the strikes, kept the control of the strait, watched American gasoline prices scale and threaten the midterms, and waited. The idea of strategic patience in use. Then it started thinking about negotiations. What it got was the money, the sanctions relief, its nuclear program, and all of this whilst controlling the world's most important oil checkpoint. What America got was, yes, oil prices coming down, some insider trading, and deal being able to call a win before November, and 60 days to figure out how to navigate all this. Now, the drone strikes just the past couple of days ago wasn't a mistake or a rogue action. It was a signal. It was telling Iran that every ship captain, every insurer, every energy company, we can still do this whenever we want to. The deal doesn't necessarily change that. The deal is about 60 days of managed escalation, managed ambiguity, while both sides prepare for the next phase of this negotiation, which hasn't actually solved anything yet and probably won't. On the first full days of talks in Switzerland, Iranian state media said negotiations had paused after the publication of an insulting message by the US president, almost like he was trying to sabotage his own peace talks. The Iranian delegation met with the Qatari mediators and left the negotiating site. That is not the behavior of a party that feels it's signed from a position of weakness. That is the behavior of a party that knows it can hold cards and comfortably use them whenever and however it wishes. Indeed, the more you look at this, take a step back, and whilst it may seem obvious, you need to put all the components together, which is what I've tried to do in this overview, simply recognizing the third parties that aren't privy to the conversations but have the most to lose. The Trump administration, with its reactionary approach, not dictating the terms but responding to what seemingly the Iranians are dictating. Ultimately, it's the Iranians which make the initial move or suggest the initial terms, and the United States is either clarifying or contradicting. But indeed, this is something that, given the discrepancy in power capabilities, you would think one is certainly being dictated to by the other. But it's the other way around, and shows you that simply pure military might is not everything. The idea of coercive diplomacy, which Trump himself likes to use so much, or attempt to at least, isn't as effective if you don't have a bigger time horizon, if you don't have a deeper strategic depth to you. And certainly that is not something reflective of the Trump administration. Now, this MOU was all about emphasis on 60 days, about dismantling the Iranian capabilities first through military capacity, but then through managed escalation, a sort of war of attrition, and now through negotiations. But it's completely different. It took years, by comparison, for the Obama administration to negotiate the JCPOA under far more favorable conditions for the United States. It took them multiple rounds of talks with a full diplomatic architecture. Trump, by contrast, has produced a deal that has a 60-day time horizon, and Iran is deliberately testing those boundaries. Lebanon is burning. Israel is not bound by this ceasefire and deliberately trying to sabotage it. And this cargo ship with a hole in its hull is sailing somewhere in the Arabian Sea, reminding everyone what Iran can largely do whenever it decides the moment is right or it feels it has a justification. If you want to understand the gap between the performance of diplomacy and the reality underneath it, well, you have to watch what's happening right now, as the Iranians are demonstrating a master practitioner of art of operating against an administration that needed a deal much more than it needed a good deal. It just needed some kind of deliverable, something to sell itself for its own satisfaction and security, as well as not just its own domestic audience, but the global international community was looking at. Whether that changes in the next 60 days, genuinely don't know. But I know what the first 10 days has looked like, and they certainly didn't look like a ceasefire. But that's it from me, everyone. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, then of course, give it a like. Subscribe if you're interested in the relationship of economics to geopolitics and understanding power from a great power political perspective, but also middle powers, or those that are able to exert themselves in ways that we might not originally think. And of course, how it all bleeds into our interests as individuals around the world. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one. Bye-bye.